Hi, everybody. I'm going to try to put things into perspective a little bit for everybody. And the way I've done that is I've outlined some of the major natural disasters we've had in the last 1,000 years. First one I got is in 1138 over in Syria, they had an earthquake and it killed about 230,000 people. Now, keep in mind that the population of the world at that time was around 300,000. So the number would have been substantially more. We've got over 20 times as many people. Now, I do realize earthquakes are kind of centralized, so it wouldn't have been 20 times, but it would have probably been 1 million people anyway. Keeping that in mind, in 1181 in Japan, they had a famine, killed 100,000 people. In 1201 over in Egypt and Syria, they had one of the worst natural disasters in history. It was an earthquake, and at that time it killed 1.1 million people, lost their life in that earthquake. At that time, the population of the earth was about 350 million. Can you imagine how many people were killed a day? In 1228, the Netherlands had a flood. The dikes broke. 100,000 people lost their lives. 1287, they had another natural disaster in the Netherlands. It was a flood where the seawall collapsed. 50,000 people in Holland were killed and 50,000 people in England. 1290, China had an earthquake where 100,000 people perished. Between 1347 and 1350, approximately 25 or 30 million people died as a result of the bubonic plague. It was called the Black Death. Now, with the way travel is today, it wouldn't have been centralized to Europe. It would have been the whole world. And it killed an estimated 25 to 30% of the people in the world. So you figure we have 7 million people, it's 30 million. And it was 30%, that's 2 billion people. That was a bubonic plague. In 1556, the population of the earth was about 450 million. China had an earthquake that 830,000 people didn't make it. It would be 3 or 4 times that if it happened today. In 1642, China had a big flood, 300,000 people were killed. In 1649, Spain had a plague, 80,000. With travel in the world the way it is today, it'd be far more than 80,000, probably 10 times that amount. The Western, mostly in the 16th and 18th, untold millions of American Indians in the Western Hemisphere died as a result of the Europeans coming over and colonizing the Americas. And they don't really want you to know how many killed, but they didn't have any natural defenses against all those diseases. But millions of American Indians died as a result of that. In 1665, England had a plague where 100,000 people perished, mostly in London. 1730, Japan had an earthquake where 137,000 people lost their lives. At that period of time, the population of the earth was about 700 million. In 1737, India had a typhoon, 300,000, mostly in Calcutta. In 1769, India had a famine. Approximately 10 million people perished in that famine, starved to death. 1775, North America had a smallpox epidemic, 130,000. I don't know what the population of the United States was, but it had to be 10 times as many now. So we're talking a couple of million people. 1780, Iran had an earthquake where 200,000 people died. 1783, Iceland had a volcanic eruption. 25% of the population of Iceland was destroyed. It was only 30,000 people, but it would be substantially more today. In 1815, in Indonesia, population in 1804 was 1 billion people, by the way. They had a volcano at Mount Tambora, Sambaya Islands, released 50 cubic kilometers of magma, over 500,000 square kilometers over Indonesia and the Java Sea. 10,000 lives and approximately 80,000 from the famine and disease that followed it. In 1826, Japan had the tsunami where we lost 27,000 people. Between 1845 and 1848, most of you have heard of this, the potato famine in Ireland, over 1 million people didn't make it, and of course there were an awful lot of people that moved. It would have been a lot worse. 1870, France, Germany, America, another smallpox epidemic, 500,000 people perished. 1876 to 1879, the deadliest drought in history. Most of the crops and the livestock died, and an estimated 9 million people. Keeping in mind there were a little over 1 billion people at that time. How many were in today? In 1803, between Java and Sumatra in Indonesia, they had a small volcanic eruption on an uninhabited island. The eruption was so loud that it was heard 5,000 kilometers away in Australia. The tsunami killed 50,000 people. 1887 in China, worst flood in modern history along the Yellow River. Overflowed 900,000 to 1 million people. Population at the time was 1.2 billion. So about 5 times as many people today. 1896, Japan had a tsunami, 28,000 people perished. 1902 in the Caribbean, volcano in the town of St. Pierre. Approximately 30,000 people were killed. The entire town, there were 3 survivors. 1908 in Italy, earthquakes, tidal wave, 123,000. 1911 in China, there was a flood, 100,000. 1915 in Italy, there was an earthquake, killed 30,000. Starting in 1918, the worst disaster in the last 1,000 years occurred when an estimated 35 million people to 100 million people died from the influenza pandemic. That was in 1915 when we had 1.5 billion people. 1920, China had a drought, killed 500 million. Also in 1920, China had an earthquake that killed 200,000. 1927, there were 2 billion people. In 1923, Japan, a third of Tokyo was destroyed from an earthquake. 145 to 200,000 people perished. 1927, China had an earthquake, 200,000 people. 1931, China had a flood in Changjiang River. Officially, there were 145,000 people perished. Some estimates are well over 1 million people. In 1932, China had another earthquake where 70,000 people were killed. 1935, the Yellow River again in China. No information on the casualties, but 3.4 million victims were impacted by that. They lost their homes, they lost everything, and many of them lost their lives. 1935, Pakistan had an earthquake, 30,000. 1939, Chile had an earthquake, 28,000. Also 1939 in China, a flood, 200,000. 1939 in Turkey, an earthquake, 32,000. 1942 to 1943, China had an awful drought. 1,000,000 plus people lost their life. 1948, USSR, Russia had an earthquake. 110,000 people didn't survive. 1950 in India. By the way, in 1950, population of the earth was 2.5 billion. 1950, India had an earthquake, 30,000. 1957, this was worldwide. Officially, there were 100,000 people died from the Asian flu. Estimates of that are up to 1,000,000, with 70,000 perishing in the United States alone. Imagine what it would be today. 1970, the population of the earth was 3.7 billion. They had an earthquake in Peru, earthquake and a landslide, killed 66,000 people. In the late 1960s to the early 1970s, Bangladesh had a cyclone and related floods, wind speeds up to 230 kilometers, 500,000 people. Vietnam in 1971, along the Red River, 100,000 people perished in that flood. 1976 in China, earthquake, officially 100,000, estimated 650,000 perished. 1981 to 1984, I think most of them are aware of the African droughts. At that time, they say there were 150 million Africans in danger of falling to starvation. The world came to their rescue. But even with that, with the disease and the starvation and all the stuff, there were still well over 1,000,000 people died as a result of that. 1985, at that time, we had 4.8 billion people. Just a note, it took us 1,000 years to go from 300 million to 4.8 billion. Between 1985 and today, that's 25 years, we've gone from 4.8 billion to 7 billion. Anyway, Colombia in 1985 had a volcano eruption, 25,000. Armenia in 1988 had an earthquake where 100,000 people died. 1990, Iran had an earthquake, 50,000. 1991, Bangladesh, they had some floods, 135,000 perished. Between 1995 and 1998, North Korea, over 3 million had died from famine and floods. 1996, West Africa had a meningitis outbreak. 25,000 were killed. 2003, Iran, earthquakes, over 25,000. 2004 to 2005, 12 South Asian nations. The 90 earthquakes resulted in a tsunami and major damage to Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Malaysia. 225,000, 275,000 killed. 2005, South Asian earthquake, over 50,000 killed. Of course, we got Haiti in 2010, where we lost 220,000, still counting. In 2011, the Japan tsunami. I'm going to run out of time. I'll give you my opinions on this a little later. Thanks. Have a good day.